Edward VI, a monarch from the Tudor dynasty, whose story is often forgotten, ruled from January 1547 to July 1553. His name is rarely associated with any significant legacy. This is Edward VI, and the maximum credit he gets is the title of Boy King, or the Boy King, which accurately reflects his influence on the history of England. His youth and inability to govern independently make his figure noticeable, but he left no significant mark on history, which is why he is largely forgotten. The era of his reign is not associated with temptations, scandals, burnings at the stake, and beheadings, at least not to the same extent as during the reigns of his relatives. Many historians regard Edward VI as a relatively insignificant figure in the history of the Tudors, giving him only a negligible amount of attention compared to other key figures of the dynasty. Let's go back to 1457. Margaret Beaufort was likely one of the few people who believed that her newborn son, Henry Tudor, had a chance to claim the English throne, despite his shaky claim at best, stemming from his great-grandfather, John Beaufort, an illegitimate son of John of Gaunt, whose descendants later became legitimized. When, in August 1485, he defeated the numerically superior seasoned army of Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth, he shocked England by ascending to the throne as King Henry VII. His son, though born in 1491 to a legitimate king, was merely a backup heir to his brother Arthur. No one expected Henry to rule England unless his brother left no heirs. It was assumed that after Arthur's ascension to the throne, Henry would devote himself to religious life. Perhaps Henry VII even felt some threat from his younger son, and thus prevented him from taking on official royal duties. However, fate, in the form of the fatal sweating sickness that claimed Arthur's life, had other plans, and Henry inherited the throne after his father in 1509. In contrast, with Edward VI, no one doubted that he would one day become king, and all of England awaited this moment. He was born on October 12, 1537, and from the very first moments of his life, he was the heir to Henry VIII. He became the beautiful prince his father had longed for throughout his adult life. As the legitimate, true son of King Henry VIII and Queen Jane Seymour, Edward Tudor was destined to rule England from birth. Unlike all other Tudors who ascended to the throne, this fact stands out, especially considering how easily he was overshadowed by more remarkable and charismatic figures from the Tudor dynasty. Edward was the only one who was destined for the crown by birthright, gender, and order of birth. Historical texts give him only superficial attention, as though he barely made an impact on history. When it comes to the Protestant Reformation in England, the first to be remembered is often Henry VIII. After all, he was the king who made the decision to break ties with the Catholic Church and declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. Elizabeth is also frequently mentioned as a key figure, as it was she who, by the time of her death in 1603, had solidified Protestantism as the main religion of England. However, despite the recognition Henry and Elizabeth received for cementing Protestantism in England, Edward's contribution is usually downplayed. Yet his achievements in this direction are numerous. Edward was surprisingly similar to his famous father, demonstrating the maturity and intelligence that amazed his tutors. He also experienced difficult but sometimes touching moments in his relationships with other family members. The young king sought to govern as effectively and decisively as Henry VIII. Edward VI, an intriguing figure who spent far too long in the shadows, deserves recognition for his contributions. His government was led and directed by men from his court, and possibly the significant Protestant reforms carried out during his reign warrant calling him a king reformer. Considering the brief introduction and the widespread misconception about Edward, along with the many ways his reign was overlooked by both historians and enthusiasts of the Tudor period, it is evident that Edward has earned the label of the unnoticed king. Unfortunately, he is largely forgotten. Stephanie Klein's book, Edward VI, the forgotten son of Henry VIII, focuses on his personal motivations and argues that despite being a boy king, Edward is truly worth remembering. For 25 years, King Henry VIII tried to produce a male heir, and finally, after 3 marriages and 2 daughters, Queen Jane Seymour, after a long labor, gave birth to a boy at Hampton Court Palace. The entire country rejoiced, celebrating this event. He was baptized at Hampton Court Chapel and named Edward after Edward the Confessor, the saint on whose feast day he was born. However, Jane Seymour fell ill with puerperal fever, possibly from the birthing wound, and died 12 days later. At the Tower Hill, a man was arrested who had prophesied that the heir to the throne would become as great a killer as his father, for even before he was born, he had already killed his own mother. In the royal chamber, strict rules and precautions were in place. No one was allowed to approach the baby's cradle without royal permission and the king's signature. All food meant for the child was tested for poison. His clothes were washed by the royal servants, and no one was allowed to touch them. All rooms in the prince's personal quarters were swept and washed with soap 3 times a day. The early years of Edward's life, up until the age of 6, were spent among women, including his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth. Together, they created the illusion of a happy family. A painting created in 1544 when Edward was 6 years old, titled "The Family of Henry VIII," illustrates this. However, it is not a depiction of family in the modern sense, with love and affection, but of a dynasty centered on power. In the middle of the portrait is Henry VIII, sitting on the throne in all his magnificence, with the Queen beside him. However, this is not his current queen, but the late Jane Seymour. She is included in the portrait because she is Edward's mother and the one who bore the heir. Edward stands to his father's right. Henry's hand rests on his son's shoulder, symbolizing the continuity of power. To the left of Henry stands Mary, his daughter from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and to the right, Elizabeth, his daughter from his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Both daughters were declared illegitimate by Henry, but they are in this portrait because he chose to include them in his will, even confirming this with an act of Parliament. The first in line is Edward, and if he were to die without heirs, the next in line was Mary. If she, too, were to die without issue, the succession would pass on. The seeds of discord for the coming decades were sown. Interestingly, Edward left us his own records from the turbulent years of his childhood, almost as though he were the hero of his own drama. Edward kept a diary. At the age of 3, he was assigned a tutor, Richard Cox, to teach him all the skills and knowledge a worthy prince should possess. 4 years later, another tutor, John Check, appeared. Both educators were scholars and humanists, followers of Erasmus and the Northern Renaissance. But most importantly, they were Protestants, and as soon as Edward ascended the throne, religious policy took a more radical Protestant direction. For this reason, he was called the Pious King. On January 28, 1547, King Henry VIII passed away, and when Edward and his sister Elizabeth were informed, both were. Upon hearing the news, England wept for the loss of its king, but Edward lost his father at an early age. From his childhood, Edward was made to believe that he was the son of a great man. Today we refer to him simply as Henry VIII, but in those days he was regarded as Henry the Great. This is how he was portrayed to his son. There exists the first portrait of Edward, where he is only 18 months old, but already a miniature copy of his father. Like him, the boy gazes directly at the viewer with a restrained expression. His right hand is raised, as if he is about to make some solemn proclamation, while a rattle in his left hand resembles a tiny scepter. At the bottom, there is a Latin inscription that translates as, "Strive to be like your father." These words were whispered into the child's ear every day, of his short life. Henry appointed 16 of his subjects as members of the Regency Council in the early years. But immediately after his death, the council decided to appoint his uncle, the Duke of Somerset, as regent for the kingdom and the king. On February 20th, 1547, the little boy walked down the main passage of Westminster Abbey, while the poorest nobles of the kingdom held above his head the crown, scepter, and orb of Edward, who had ascended to the throne of England at the age of 9. Some subjects hailed him as the new Josiah, as Josiah, son of Ammon, ascended to the throne at the age of 8 and ruled with the aim of doing God's will. He destroyed all idols and repented of the Catholic faith in England. In the spring of 1547, 3 months after his coronation, a series of court orders were issued for the complete cleansing of the churches. All wall manuscripts and icons of the saints were to be removed from sight, rosaries banned, the lighting of candles, kneeling, the decoration of holy images, and pilgrimages to saints were no longer allowed. In the most radical areas of London, all stained glass windows were removed or destroyed. Orders decreed that intricate, multi-layered music was no longer to be played, and organs fell silent. In fact, the efforts for reform made from 1547 to 1553 were so significant that some argue Henry VIII never envisioned such further developments. While the dissolution of monasteries and the confiscation of treasures from Catholic churches began under Henry, under Edward VI, the removal of icons, statues, stained glass windows, and prayer books from the Roman Catholic Church intensified significantly. Henry VIII initiated the creation of the first 10 articles in 1536, outlining the initial doctrine for his England, followed by 2 revisions in 1539 and 1543. However, Edward and his government made significant Protestant changes by adopting the 42 Articles in 1552. These articles raised Calvinist and anti-Catholic heights, although they were never formally implemented due to Edward's premature death. They laid the important foundation for the final 39 articles in 1571 under Elizabeth I, which remain the defining doctrine of the Church of England today. Could the modern Anglican Church have been envisioned without these significant steps forward during Edward VI's reign, which influenced Elizabeth I's subsequent rule? Most historians would likely argue that it could not have. Thomas Seymour, Edward's other uncle, who also sought power, attempted to ingratiate himself with his young nephew. He began visiting him privately, secretly giving him money and flattering him by criticizing his brother. After the death of Catherine Parr, Thomas Seymour plotted to marry Princess Elizabeth, and rumors spread that she was pregnant by the Lord Admiral. Seymour was denounced, arrested on January 17, 1549, and charged with treason under 3 articles. This, of course, was an exaggeration. However, the protector, his brother, feared that opponents would strike against him through his brother. For this reason, Seymour was declared an outlaw in Parliament without any trial, and his execution took place on March 20th of that same year. Edward VI began to face his own problems with Scotland. He intended to win the war started by Henry VIII and force Scotland to comply with the terms of the Treaty of Greenwich, uniting the 2 crowns and arranging a marriage between young Edward VI and Mary Stuart, the Queen of Scots. However, the campaign failed compared to Henry VIII's efforts. Somerset spent 1.5 times more money on Scotland in half the time. The coinage lost value, and the currency was devalued. This was the cost of war. Somerset decided to remedy the situation with a new economic policy of land enclosures. In May, uprisings began in Somerset, Hampshire, Kent, Essex, and other counties. Somerset threatened the rebels, but it was already too late. The uprisings exploded in June in Norfolk, Cambridgeshire, Hertfordshire, Berkshire, Oxfordshire, and Yorkshire. In July, Leicester joined in, and the rebellion was increasingly difficult to suppress. By the spring of 1549, things had escalated and the rebellion spilled over into accusations of unjust leniency and even solidarity with the rebels. Cornered, Somerset decided to capture Edward as a hostage and hold him at Windsor Castle. We can only imagine what the 12-year-old boy felt that night when an armed group pulled him from his bed at Hampton Court and transported him to Windsor. "I am a prisoner," he writes in his diary. In one night, Edward transformed from a child into a king. Somerset had to surrender, and he was immediately sent to the Tower, where the Duke of Somerset confessed to 9 charges of treason. At the age of 13, Edward decided to rule on his own. He was very similar to his father, and with such coldness he describes the executions of his uncles. Today, at Tower Hill between 8 and 9 in the morning, the Duke of Somerset had his head cut off. He writes in his diary, "His heart had no place with his sister Mary." Lady Mary was the only significant supporter of the old faith, and she was also the cousin of Europe's strongest monarch, Emperor Charles V. In the spring, Edward deprived Mary of her privileges to observe Catholic rites and called for obedience to the law of unity. Her cousin expressed protest and sent envoys to Edward, further angering him. By the end of June, 4 warships arrived at the Essex coast to help Mary escape from England. But Mary was intercepted, and even stricter surveillance was placed on the princess. Edward called his sister to London for a report on her conduct. "Lady Mary, my sister," he writes in his diary, "came to Westminster. 'My soul belongs to the Lord,' she replied. 'I will not change my faith, and I will not hypocritically conceal my beliefs.'" In early April 1553, Edward contracted tuberculosis of the lungs, and doctors gave him no more than 9 months to live. Edward understood that the work of his life, the work of his father, his beliefs, and his reformed England might disappear, and he decided to exclude the possibility of his sister Mary ascending to the throne. The young king, personally, drafted plans. At first, he planned to pass the throne to a Protestant male heir from the line of Henry VII's younger sister Mary, but Frances, Duchess of Suffolk, had no sons. In the end, he named as his successor the elder daughter of the Duchess of Suffolk. With a single stroke of the pen, Edward made Jane Grey Queen of England. On June 21st, the Parliament declared his sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, illegitimate and called for a new Parliament. However, when Edward died on July 6th, Northumberland, Jane Grey's father-in-law, was not ready. He waited 3 days before declaring Jane Queen. During this time, Mary had already escaped to Norfolk. Like her father, she was determined and unyielding, with a strong sense of her own destiny. She gathered an army and set off with full popular support. The people wanted a true Tudor on the throne, even at the cost of their faith. And so, Queen Jane was deposed and imprisoned almost as quickly as she had ascended to the throne. The people wanted the legitimate Queen Mary, and 2 weeks after Edward's death, the virtue of Lady Mary was proclaimed queen, and Edward's attempts to establish a new order were undone. The Protestant line of succession was disrupted, and the changes in the order of inheritance clearly reflected Edward's personal beliefs and his determination to create a Protestant England. Regardless of whether these changes were sustained, Edward's zealous Protestantism and his actions against Catholic Mary had a significant impact on her harsh attempts at counter-reformation in England between 1555 and 1558. His actions did not lead to a reduction in Protestant support, but rather strengthened it, alongside growing backing for Princess Elizabeth. Stephanie Klein's book, Edward VI, The Forgotten Son of Henry VIII, explores these themes. Leave your thoughts in the comments. If Edward VI had lived and ruled England, would he have been as harsh as Henry VIII? Or would England have been entirely different?